when I preach, it's always a big challenge. And I always know how I did because I go and sit down. And I remember one time I preached here because it's a big deal to preach here. I mean, this is wonderful. And this is preaching Mecca, actually. And I sat down, and Misty's reaction was, wow, I hope that that's not the last sermon you ever give here. So I know when it goes well, and I know when it does not
I give my
go
honest input.
well, obviously. And so anyway, we'll
You're
see
a
how
very good preacher. I love your preaching.
Thank you,
Just
honey.
that one time I
Yeah,
was
it was
really
really bad.
worried about.
So I think it was about submission. Was that the one? Ah,
Probably,
okay.
yeah.
So anyway, last week we talked about this vicious triangle of the victim and the rescuer and the persecutor. Remember that? And did anybody identify at any time during the week that you were persecuting someone? And wow, look at that. Honesty, open. That's wonderful. And anybody do any rescuing? Anything like that? Yeah, okay. And then, of course, just that whole thing
Victim.
of what?
Victim.
Yeah, being a victim. Anybody a victim? Well, me. Boy, you would not believe how many times I was the victim. But anyway, so what? But all of them, really are choices. They're all choices, and we can all choose something different. And I just want to say that, we got these extremes in the triangle. And in those extremes are actually sometimes some good motives in the extreme. The persecutor thinks maybe like they're standing up for what's right sometimes or whatever. And so if we could take the good stuff and then function in the middle, then we end up being sensitive to other people, not trying to persecute them or rescue them or uh, anything, or being the victim. If we can be compassionate and if we can be responsible, and here's the key, solution focused in everything we're going to do. Now, this evening, we're going to talk about boundaries. And this is something that, I was doing radio with John Townsend and Henry Cloud many, many years ago. And they were working on a book, and Dave Stoop and myself, we were working on a book. We wrote The Angry Man and sold 7 copies of that book. And John and Henry, about the same time, published Boundaries and sold 7 million copies of that book. So anyway, I'm not jealous or bitter over just that book. But anyway, it's been a big part of the New Life ministry, part of me, and over the years we've watched this in many ways be used. And some people, it's the beginning of a real relationship, this thing called establishing a healthy boundary. But for other people over the years, I've received calls, we've done it on radio, where they would say the worst thing that ever happened to me was this person read this book, Boundaries, because they used it and it destroyed our relationship. Well, there's really one of two reasons that would happen. Either, this was a really sick person and somebody finally said no to the sickness, and then, or the other reason is somebody abused the concept of boundaries. So we want to try to find that healthy use of it. The subtitle for the book Boundaries is When to Say Yes and When to Say No to Take Control of Your Life. And I think the subtitle is more powerful than just that word boundary, because really that's what life is. It's saying yes to the right things and no to the right things and being in control rather than being controlled. So with that, why don't you start us and then I'll jump back in.
Yeah, so we touched a little bit the idea of a hula hoop last week. You remember we've been talking about squares and triangles and circles, and so when we got to our circle, we envision a hula hoop around us. And really, this is sort of the visual for boundaries. So boundaries in John and Henry's material, they would describe it as it's a fence around my yard. It's a property line. It's what I am responsible for. And outside of that fence is what is belongs to somebody else and it's not mine. So the things that are inside of my hula hoop, what I'm responsible for, there's a list you might want to jot down. If you have a circle and you can jot down my beliefs I am responsible for my beliefs, my values, my intentions, my goals, my sorrows, my feelings, my actions, my choices. So it's very easy to say, oh, you made me feel angry. You did that and that made me angry. So it's your fault that I'm angry. When in reality, I still am the owner of my feelings. And I am the one that decides if I do or don't like what someone else is doing. And we can say, well, anyone would be mad about that. And that may be true. But the reality is that I'm the one living in the situation and I'm the one that's affected. And so I take ownership of even my feelings. I can't push those off to somebody else. Now, the most natural boundary, God given boundary that we have is very clear. We have a person, I have a physical body, I have a being, and I live inside here. And you have your body and you live inside there. That is your place, and no one else belongs there but you. That's why personal offenses can be very upsetting because this is the only place that I have to live. It is sacred, it is given to me by God. And an interesting thing to notice is just, I have given birth to 4 children and nursed 4 babies. Very fortunate in that. I'm very grateful for that. And one of the things that I really soaked in while I was in that zone with newborns is that the baby, they don't, when they're nursing and they're with their mom and it's all the skin to skin and milk and nourishment and warmth and connection, they don't know where they don't know that we're separate. They don't know where they stop and I begin. It's just all, and hopefully it's supposed to be a lot of love and goodness and everything wonderful, right? Is the goal in that. And it's kind of this really sacred, sweet stuff, to just be in that zone. And as a baby grows, they begin to realize that they are their own person, their own being, and that and the job is to grow up and become an individual. And so you can understand how it's hard for moms sometimes. We share a physical space, um, and sometimes the growing up process can be hard. But the skin is a point of where I end and you begin. That's our meet, and that's where we meet to negotiate the terms of our relationship. Okay, so what boundaries is not? Boundaries is not a constraint or a hula hoop that I put on somebody else to contain their behavior and control them. We love to try that. I love that experiment, and I do that a lot. We all kind of do it unconsciously in some ways, but it's not a way that I'm going to try to control someone else. It's not a restriction I place on someone else. I get to make requests from my own hula hoop. And at this point, we negotiate the terms of our relationship.
So I was talking with a person that works with a certain group of young women, and she said that when she says this to them, they can't believe that it's true. That if they accept a date with a guy, that they don't have to have sex with that guy. That they find that to be amazing, that that would be even true. That in this particular world that they live in, if you're with a guy and you're together, that's just what you do. It's just you go to eat and then you have some kind of sexual relationship. What an amazing thing to discover. Wait a second. I don't have to do anything with my body, with my inside my skin or out, that I don't want to do. In fact, in this culture where, it's a post-Christian culture, it's pretty shocking what the attitudes and the principles are in the dating situation. But if you don't have some firm boundaries with some grace filled interaction, you can really end up in trouble a lot. And so it's important that to be able to have the boundary, but also to be a person who has love, compassion for the other person, or you're like a cactus. You don't want to be a cactus if you're dating. Now, when it comes to marriage, there's another problem. You have this verse that says, and the two shall become one flesh. A lot of people believe that to mean two people, you get married, and you fuse and you merge into this single entity. And one person or both lose their identity. Actually, the way it works is one maintains his identity, the other one loses it. Not true. In fact, I do think that the two become one flesh is much more um, realistic. It's about sexual intimacy, is what you're talking about. That's where you become one flesh, but you don't become one psyche or one emotional being. We have to be separate. The situation of boundaries can establish us as married, but still I'm an individual. And a lot of marriages bust up because that's never truly been done very well. In marriage, you need boundaries. A lot of marriages don't have the right boundaries. We had a guy call, and he was, I think he was 76 or so, and his problem was that women were just coming on to him right and left, that he just couldn't even control it, that he had no idea why it was such a problem for his wife, because these women just were coming to him and they were so attracted to him. It was amazing. And so I told him, I said, I've never really had that problem. But then I was doing the show with a couple other people, I always do, and really they were saying the reason that this is a problem for you is because you like to be fascinating to women. So you engage with them with your eyes and everything that you are. You let them know you're available to you and not so much married. So you've never established this boundary for your marriage that keeps engagement with other women out. And until you do that, you're always going to be upsetting your wife by the kind of engagement you have with people outside of the marriage. So a marriage isn't, I really think when people get married, you ought to just list the things that you're not just committing to not have sex with somebody else. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there that you ought to be committing to. And that's why premarital counseling is so important. We want to come together when we're married with boundaries that protect the marriage and then boundaries that protect us as individuals. But now, here's something that my own personal therapist talks to me all the time about. That selfishness is the gateway drug to mental illness. Selfishness and self-obsession is how we get in trouble. Add a little chemical imbalance or some faulty wiring to self-obsession, anxiety about everything that isn't me, and I can get pretty obsessed with what I need to do to stay in control, and I might use a boundary not as a way to preserve my identity, but as a way to protect myself and my self-obsession and all the things that are me. Being true to myself, I could not be true to the marriage. I need to be true to the marriage and in that process be true to me. So it's tricky. That's my word of the year for 2019. I don't know what 20 is going to be, but it's tricky. Just like everything, it has to have balance. So we create freedom and safety if I marry somebody that honors my boundaries and I honor their boundaries. And then we give security in what they believe, what I believe, who I am. And when we do this with our kids, when we have proper boundaries, there's respect and identity that's created. And if I don't let my kids have their own identity and their own boundaries, then I keep them merged or enmeshed with me. It's an unhealthy relationship. And then guess what? At age 32, they're living in the basement or in the same room with the pennants on the wall where they were raised because they didn't establish that healthy identity. And then when we have proper boundaries with another person and we know their boundaries and respect them, then we have freedom in the relationship and we have freedom outside of the relationship.
Which is counterintuitive. Boundaries sounds restrictive or, just, I don't know. To me, the word can sound harsh, but it's actually opens, a safety so that we can have a safe relationship and loving and exchange and mutuality together because we're not worried about there's going to be, some kind of trauma all the time. We know that we're respected, we offer respect, and then we get to thrive relationally.
Yeah. So in our situation, Misty's never had a problem with that she's told me about of having her own identity, her own strength, who she is, um, and and by the same token, I think we've been free inside the marriage then to not have a problem in separating us from our kids. That there's certain things they're not a part of. They can't be certain places when it's just for us or just about us. And a lot of parents, there's no separation. There's no time for us. The kids are just all in this, and that can be an unhealthy situation. So boundaries really are, you could say, they're limits, but they're invitations for someone to accept you as who you are. So I think what you're saying is that you are asking about a relationship, not a marriage relationship, and a person has some pretty strong boundaries, but unable or have yet to share with you the expectations that the boundaries bring. And so, uh, and when you would ask about those expectations, what are your expectations? I mean, I see that you have strong boundaries. You'd say to the person, I see you have a lot of boundaries. What are your expectations? What would the response be when you would just simply ask them? And so, what are your expectations around these boundaries? What would their response be? What's that? Okay, so
So at that point, then we have a choice of how much interaction we're going to have with that person. If they're not willing to articulate what they need and they're constantly getting upset, that's a signal to me this isn't safe. They're not able to negotiate the terms of the relationship. I may need to step back. I may need to bring in reinforcement and help and reaching out. But there are a lot of options. The main thing to know is that I have choice. I don't have to put myself in front of this person the same way every time.
yeah, and in a really Christian way, you could say, this is kind of stupid because you you have expectations and you're not sharing those with me, and I've invited you to, and you still don't share those. So um, let's talk about that. And if they don't want to talk about that, then I think you're really dealing with somebody that's got a problem that might be too big just to be resolved in growing closer to them. And so then maybe a question is really curious. The last relationship where you were in, how did that turn out? Or another great question is, were you ever in your childhood really hurt by somebody that was older than you? And then you find out why, because life makes sense. And whereas I tend to make light of something, um, that person's probably a pretty hurt and damaged person if they have expectations that are protective, but they don't share them.
Go ahead and talk about the
Okay.
difference between a boundary and a wall.
Okay, difference between a boundary and a wall. A wall prevents being known. I put up a wall like that, but a boundary, I'm establishing my identity. Not like some narcissistic identity, but this is just who I am at this time. I'm growing, but here's where I've landed. The wall separates me from everybody, but a boundary invites you to connect with me appropriately, like as a mutually worthy person in the world. A wall assumes there's no hope for this, so I have to put up a wall. It's kind of over or never begins. But a boundary is kind of a call to change. Here's something I'm uncomfortable with. I really got to kind of set this limit or this boundary. Maybe we can work through that and talk about it. The wall is born out of anger and fear. I mean, they're angry at everybody in your gender or your age or whatever, or I'm afraid that I'm going to get hurt again. But the boundary is born out of love and respect. Love for myself and God, respect for what God's created in me and with me, and love and respect for you also. My wall is reactive. I'm reacting to something, but the boundary is responsive. It's a healthy response to what I do. Um, the wall creates anger, shame, retaliation, but a boundary, it's safe. It creates safety and standards. And then my wall devalues you or maybe shames you. I don't associate with people like you, but the boundary simply elevates the value of everybody, me and the value of you. And then two more. The wall is a way of me to step away from you. Boom, there it is. I'm not going to be part of that. And then the boundary is stepping toward you. I want to be close to you, but I don't want to be that close, or I want to share with you, but I don't want to share everything with you. Here's the boundary. Finally, the wall is a limit on me, and it's a limit on you that can't be broken. But the boundary is simply defining my choices, because I believe that I'm worthy of having choices, and I want to honor God with my choices.
Okay, so there are two more areas that I want to mention about where boundaries are really important. So it's with ourselves and whatever else we're involved in. So maybe I set limits with food or bedtimes, sexual engagement, my thoughts, feelings, actions, right? If I'm not able to keep my own boundaries and my own behavior, that might be an indicator of my willingness to honor the boundaries of someone else, right? So if things are getting progressively worse, that's an indicator of a problem. Like, let's say I know I need to be getting to bed earlier. It's a real simple example. And I find myself staying up later and later and later. I might notice, hey, I'm not keeping my own boundary. Like, I have something that would provide a good situation for me. Sleep, that's really fantastic. I love sleep. And if I can't seem to go there, what is it? Why am I not able to keep my own boundary? And it's a really good thing to have in place because it helps us measure a bit when we're off track, and we can see if something's getting progressively worse. That's a sign I might need some help. Another thing to look at is just that God has boundaries with us, right? He gives us the span of one lifetime to make a decision to invite him into our lives and to share this, life together eternally. That is a boundary that he has with us. He doesn't just let anyone into his kingdom. He's got criteria for who comes into his house. Um, he says he's not going to bless evil action. He says he's not going to lie to me. He's limitless, but he limits himself, right? He's not going to go against who he is. He says he's going to love me even when I keep my distance. He says he's going to forgive. He also assures me that there will be consequences. Just that's how it is. If I kick a can, it's going to go that way. There are just results to the choices that we make. He set a boundary in the Garden of Eden, and there were consequences for our rebellion. Love stayed, but the boundary put a limit for us. Okay, so we get all these commandments, we get suggestions. I wanted to mention the difference between control, and a strong suggestion. So a boundary is like a strong suggestion. It's like, hey, when you do this, that doesn't work for me, and so when you do this, here's what I'm going to do, or it's just defining, here's what matters to me. This is how I'm going to behave. And that other person can know that. So we can share, our beliefs, we can make requests, and we can live into the who we are, and other people have a choice about what they're going to do with that. The big deal, if I'm getting sucked into the victim, persecutor, rescuer triangle, is to look at boundaries. If I'm feeling like a victim of everybody else, where do I have choice? I always have choice. Is this part of what God has given to each of us? And finally, speaking of boundaries for children, we have to be, as parents, really careful in helping our children have limits so that they learn to practice setting limits for themselves. What else did you want to say?
Well, when Dave Stoop and I wrote Take Your Life Back, we, when you factor a number, you try to break it down into smaller numbers. So we tried to take boundaries, which is an interesting concept, and break it down into some very, very doable, easy to understand words that started with D. As I've said before, I will die of alliteration asphyxiation. And tonight it's D's. So if I am a person with healthy boundaries, I am the one that will, I'll be the decider in my life. Even when I get married, I'm still the decider in my life. There's nothing where I say, I will no longer have the ability to make decisions. And so sometimes in a traditionally weird marriage where you got a dictator and a doormat, they got to say, well, yeah, I mean, we agree, we make decisions together. And then if we disagree on something, I'm the tiebreaker. Okay, so what you just said was, as long as your wife agrees with you, she has freedom to do anything. But when not, you're going to be the one to make the decision. I said, that is not her being the decider. That is you. So when we have healthy boundaries, I'm the decider. And when my deciding interferes with or goes against your deciding, then we have to do some things. We have to look for another alternative, a compromise, or hey, let's go my way this time, let's go your way, or let's get a third party to help us figure this out, or let's just put it on hold for a while. That's so much different. But if you're not the decider, and one night we were having a meeting with all the people, and the person that's over the women's groups who have been in this church, women who have been hurt by a man with a sexual integrity problem, she said, none of our women are the deciders in the relationship. This is after they have been found out, after they have been uncovered, and they're still in a relationship where they're not making choices for themselves. So, if you have healthy boundaries, you're the decider. Second thing is that you are the defender of your value. Second D is defender. Now, if you don't think you have value, if you think you're second rate because of something you did, you haven't fully accepted God's grace, then you're not going to defend your value. You're just going to think, oh, I'm so lucky just to be here. Or I'd rather be attached to something sick than nothing at all. What's horrible? So, decider, defender, and the developer of good things. Not sitting around waiting for somebody to do something good for me or thinking, well, she'll just finally wake up, then I'm going to be great. No, I have to develop good things for me. So those are three things when I have healthy boundaries. I'm the developer of the good things. I'm not waiting for somebody else. I'm the decider in my life. And I'm the defender of my value. And then, if I'm those three things, I have the freedom to let God be the director, fourth D, of my life. And with that, I am done. Fifth D. All right, boundaries.
Okay. So that's just a super light touch of boundaries. You guys know the word, you've heard, and we're interested in your discussion. So you've got your questions on the table. Have a good time talking things through. We'll come back in about 30 minutes with Q&A. Thanks.
Okay.